I'm producing some chess coaching videos on behalf of the ACT Junior Chess League based here in Canberra, Australia, for not just for ACT Junior Chess League members, but for anyone that's interested. It's targeted mainly at junior players who are just starting out, although unlike previous two videos that I've done, this will probably contain a little bit more higher level stuff for those that are interested. Normally the format of this is I look at three different concepts, normally one to do with an ending or checkmating idea, one to do with the middle game, and one to do with some planning. But as I said, different videos cover different things. I'm a chess player, a FIDE master, and a chess coach, a qualified FIDE trainer. And I'm doing these on a semi-regular basis, and this is video number 3. So the first position I'm going to look at, so previously we had looked at how to checkmate with king and queen versus king and rook versus king. And these are things you really do need to know. But why do you need to know them? When you first start playing chess, it's very rare that you get a position like that. But as you get further into your chess career, you'll find that it's a lot harder just to either checkmate your opponent or find an opponent who will let you capture things for free. So you get to a situation where lots of things get swapped off, and the end of the game then comes down to, for example, in this case, the side with the extra pawn trying to make a queen. Now in this position here, the immediate threat is if it was black's move, black would just take the pawn, and king and rook versus king and rook is normally drawn. And so there are a couple of ways we have to deal with this. If you're starting out, the most obvious way is to try and move your pawn to safety. But after a move like this, black is just going to move the rook behind the pawn and threaten to capture it. And we play rook g3 for checking. And then either the king can go to h7, and we check again, king to g8, rook to g3, and we just move our king here. And there are no more checks, and after rook h3, we're just simply going to take the pawn down here on c7. But this is not the end of this position. I'm just going to show you one thing that you've just got to be careful about. If you are careless in a position like this, you can run into a trick. So if I go back to this position here, after rook g3, king h7 is fine. After king f7, there is a little trick here that you can walk into if you're not careful, and that's rook h3. And if you very carelessly take the pawn on c7 in this position, rook to h7 skewers the king and the rook, and so the king has to move out of check and you win the rook. And as I said before, one of the things that you need to be able to do is to checkmate with king and rook versus king. And this is why in the previous video I showed you how to do that, because this is a position that you might end up with. Back here we played rook c7, rook h8, and of course we've got a couple of choices here. King f7 is wrong because we get back to that same position. You could play either king g7, or the other option is just to play king e7 here. And after rook h7 check, as much as the rook is attacking the king and the rook behind it, we play king d8, rook takes c7, king takes c7, and king against king, of course, is a well-known draw. So we can't play c7. That doesn't work. So we come back to our starting position, and basically the key move is rook to g3. And what we want to do is we want to force the rooks off the board by pinning the black rook against the king. So the black rook now can't take the pawn because you'd put yourself in check. And there's a few choices. One is to move the king out of the way and hope the next move you're going to be able to take. But unfortunately, rook takes here first. And then when the king takes, we play c7. And the king is too far away from capturing the pawn. And after king f7, we make our queen. And again, why we learn to checkmate with king and rook versus king, and why we learn to checkmate with king and queen versus king, is so we can win these positions. There's no point in playing well enough to get to a position like this and then not knowing what to do. The other choice after rook g3, of course, is just to take. Rook takes g3, king takes g3, king to f7, but the pawn is too far away. c7, king e7, and we make our queen. And we go from there and we checkmate. So that's the basic idea there, is that in a position like this, okay, swapping the rooks off is the right idea, especially if the pawn can't be caught. And then once the rooks have come off, promote and be able to win the king and queen ending. Okay, moving on to our next thing. I will save this one. Thank you. Okay. This was a game played in a tournament the other day. And it's an interesting one because it both covers an opening that juniors really like, but at the same time there's some other lessons about not choosing the first move that enters your head, but being a little bit more sensible and looking at a couple of alternatives, especially looking at when you move what your opponent can do. So we start the game with e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, knight f6, knight g5. Okay, and the idea is that bishop and knight are attacking f7, which is always a weak square. d5. So suddenly the pawn is stopping the bishop from attacking f7. He takes d5. Now, this position is well known to lots of juniors. They've seen it 100 times, and they all want to play it as white, if they're allowed to. So after knight takes d5, which seems like the obvious move to win back the pawn, knight takes f7 starts the infamous fried liver attack. Juniors really love this, probably because of the name, not so much because of the moves. So knight takes f7. Ask yourself, why can't you take? And you can. And then queen f3. And the important thing here is that to notice is that this knight is now attacked twice, but is only defended once by the queen. So given the opportunity, white will just take the knight. And having won a pawn by sacrificing the knight down here, they win back the knight and they're a pawn ahead. So king e6 is the move, and that protects. Now, if you get to this position as black, I don't recommend that you take the pawn on d5, but if you must, and you are faced with a move like this, which is now an extra piece attacking, so you now have 3 pieces, knight, bishop, queen, and only 2 pieces defending, queen and king, play knight to b4 here. And so you've got an extra piece attacking, and you're also looking at, if your opponent isn't careful, okay, this square here, attacking the king and the rook. Okay. Bishop b3 to protect c2, and then you can just play c6. And you've got enough defenders now. And as much as this position isn't completely winning for black, at the level that most juniors play at, it's very difficult for white to find the winning ideas here. And black is still a piece ahead, okay, and is almost out of danger. So the best move coming all the way back here, by the way, is not to sacrifice on f7, so not to play the fried liver attack, but to play a move like d4. And the idea is you want to open up the position with e takes, then you castle, and after h6 you can sacrifice. But all the good moves in this position are well and truly beyond the scope of what I'm talking about today. Maybe another lesson, I'll look at this one, but for now, the recommendation is in fact to play what black played here. Knight to a5, don't even take the pawn on d5. Attack the bishop instead. So white moves the bishop to safety by checking, and after we put the pawn up to block, we take, and we take here. Notice the bishop can't take the pawn because the knight is guarding. It was this point that white started to go wrong, and I suspect it's because white's only seen enough of this opening to get to here without seeing the rest of the moves. And while studying openings is only part of chess, and juniors really love to study openings a lot, sometimes you do need to know enough to avoid the traps. And white played bishop a4, which turns out to be bad for a number of reasons, which I'll go into in a bit. Funnily enough, when I was learning this opening as a junior, I also wanted to know what was wrong with bishop a4 and had to look it up to find the answer. Instead, the right idea is to play the bishop all the way back to e2, and after h6, which drives the knight away, the knight goes back to f3, and black can just keep kicking the knight with e4. Knight goes to e5, bishop d6, and pawn to d4. And this position is surprisingly okay for black. Black's surrendered a pawn. Here, white's ahead 1 pawn, and black's pawn structure looks a bit ragged, but at the same time, black is developing their pieces, which you want to do in the opening, and white still has a little bit more work to do in terms of development. Instead, bishop a4. Now, black didn't find the right move in this position, but if you get to a position like this, you can potentially win a piece with a move like h6. So the knight moves back to f3. You play the knight. You play the pawn to e4. The knight goes to e5, and then queen d4 is a fantastic move. It's attacking the knight and it's attacking the bishop. And you can't defend both of them at the same time, and you've managed to lose a piece. So if you get that position, h6 is the key move. Instead, black played bishop to c5, and the idea is, of course, we're looking at f2 in some lines. So much so that after knight c3, black immediately sacrificed on f2. Nothing wrong with sacrificing on f2 in a lot of openings. It just shouldn't have worked in this case. Turns out that it did, but it should not. So the king took. And the tactical idea is the knight attacks the king while the queen comes out and attacks the unprotected knight here. And that was what black was counting on. Okay? But it misses a couple of things further in the position. And this is what I say, you've got to try and look at your opponent's replies. Imagine the king goes here and we play the immediate queen takes g5, which is winning the piece back, which is the right idea here. White would have then had b4. Okay? Remember, right at the start, going all the way back here, I mentioned that the bishop couldn't take the pawn because it was guarded by the knight. After b4, what happens to the knight? If it moves to b7, it's not guarding the pawn anymore. We've removed the defender. So the knight on a5 was the defender. We've forced it to move, and we just take on c6. And after king f8, queen f3, we're threatening to take the knight again on b7. And after rook b8, white is bet here. White's just up a pawn. Okay. Looks like they might be able to castle, and the black king can't castle. The rook on h8 is stuck in the corner. The other line to play is just castles here, but then you're surrendering a piece, and there's not much left in this position. B takes a5, knight takes h2. Not sure why I've typed these moves in, to be honest. Queen e2. That's probably a line that I picked up from somewhere else. But yeah, I wouldn't necessarily worry about that. Castles, bishop takes a5 here. And there shouldn't be too much drama in this position. That's right. I looked at knight takes h2 because there is one more trick. After rook takes h2, which is tempting, queen to g3. And then once the king moves, we take the rook down here. But anyway, that wasn't the worst of it. After king takes f2, knight g4, white played an automatic move without checking what their opponent's reply was. I suspect all they thought there was going to happen was that the queen would take the knight. So they put the king on g1, thinking, oh, well, the king's nice and safe there. And queen takes g5, picks up some material, but doesn't win the game. It turns out that queen d4 is actually the winning move here. It's a check. The check can't be blocked. There's only one move that white can play in this position, which was king to f1, and then queen f2 is checkmate. So the lesson here is, of course, before you choose your move, you've got to think about what your opponent's replies are going to be. Because you don't get two moves in a row in chess. So in this case, this is where white went terribly wrong. They thought they knew what their opponent was going to do, but they didn't look at all the different replies. A good starting point is to look at all checks and all captures. And in this case, if white had seen queen d4 check, they would never have played king to g1. Last game I'm going to look at, or the last idea I'm going to look at, I'll just save this one as well, okay, is playing for checkmate. Okay, so we always want to checkmate our opponent. The obvious way to checkmate our opponent is something like the 4-move checkmate. But as I keep saying, once we get to a certain level, our opponents aren't going to let that happen. You might be able to checkmate your dad or your little brother, but once you start playing in competitions and you start playing good players, they're not going to just let you checkmate them as easily as that. So what you've kind of got to do is you've got to prepare yourself for a checkmate. And you do that by bringing out lots of pieces. You just don't bring out your queen and your bishop, because that's not going to be good enough. You need to bring out more pieces than that. So for example, this was another game that was played in the tournament recently. So e4, e6. Funnily enough, this immediately stops the 4-move checkmate. Okay. Having said that, I once saw a game that went like this, and I'm just going to show it to you for laughs. Bishop here, white went here, and white played queen takes f7 and said, that's checkmate. And the opponent picked up the king and took the queen and said, no, it's not. Because the pawn on e6 blocks the bishop from protecting f7. So instead, white played knight f3, defending. The other move here is to play d4 straight away, even though that does happen later in the game. d5, pawn to e5, c5, c3, knight c6. Okay, and the idea is that we're going to move the pawn to d4, and if the pawn on c5 takes, the pawn on c3 will capture. Instead, bishop b5 was played, pinning the knight, and black played knight to h6. Now white played the d4 move, as I thought, and knight went to f5. And in this position, white didn't suddenly go, oh, I'm going to play something like bishop to g5, attacking the queen and hoping the queen doesn't move, and then I'll capture it next move. White sensibly cast, and I give it a little exclamation mark, not because it was a good move, it's the obvious move in the position, but because it just shows that there's some common sense here. We're not going to checkmate until we get all our pieces ready, or our opponent makes a mistake and gives us the opportunity. Queen to b6, and we're attacking the bishop. So white took bishop takes knight, they're of equal value. Some might argue that the bishops are worth slightly more than the knights because they can move a long distance. But after queen takes, bishop f4, developing another piece. And black took the pawn and white captured back with the pawn. And after bishop e7, white plays knight c3. So where's the checkmate? There is no checkmate at this point. All we're doing is we're bringing our pieces out. And the idea is that we will be prepared if our opponent makes a mistake. So we don't necessarily go and put our pieces on bad squares, hoping our opponent doesn't miss the threat. We put them on good squares because that means that when the opponent does make a mistake, we're better placed to take advantage of that. And I'll give you a perfect example in a couple of moves. We could have played g4 here, for example, and the idea simply being that if the knight goes back to h6, bishop takes, g takes, queen here. And this idea is about to turn up in this game. But the idea here is their opponent played a slightly poor move with castling before working out what to do with the knight on f5. Instead, white played queen d2 with a similar idea. So the rooks are now working together. Rook a to c1 could also be played with the idea of looking at attacking the queen. And black missed the threat and just played b5. And now g4 was played. And the knight went back to h6. b4 could have been tried. So the idea is if take me, take you. But after knight e2, here, the knight goes to h4, and we just exchange off the knights. The bishop recaptures, and this pawn on b4 is unprotected, and the queen just takes. Again, it's not the brilliant checkmate that I promised, but white has won a pawn just by having their pieces on good squares. And sometimes in chess, you don't get to checkmate in under 20 moves in every game. You win by just capturing opponent's material and eventually just getting a queen at the end of the game. But instead, black hopped back here. And suddenly, the point about having pieces on good squares is what really comes true here. The bishop was on a nice square, the knight was on a nice square, the queen sitting here as well. So much so that after bishop takes h6, pawn takes h6, the queen can capture. So two things have now happened. White's captured a pawn, and there's a pawn ahead, but more importantly, the squares around the black king are a little bit more open, so much so that there is a chance that the white pieces can start to occupy these squares. So the king went to h8, possibly afraid of various checks, but this allowed white to find a very nice checkmating idea here, knight to g5. And the idea, of course, is that the knight is protecting h7 and the queen is going to h7, and that is checkmate. And there are no black pieces that can protect this square. So next move, white is going to play queen takes h7. But hang on, you say. Surely the bishop on e7, this guy, can take this guy. And they can. So you eliminate the piece that is protecting h7, so that after queen takes h7, the king would be able to take. But this bishop had two jobs. It needed to both protect the rook and capture the knight. And so forced to do one of those two jobs, in this case capture the knight, it stopped doing the other job of protecting the rook, and so queen takes f8 landed on the board. And this is checkmate. There's no escape squares for the king, and there's no way of putting anything in the road. So the lesson from there is that although white didn't immediately just go, I'm going to try and checkmate on f7 or I'm going to checkmate on h7, they had their pieces developed in the opening, they put them on good squares, and when the opponent made a mistake, well, a couple of mistakes, one which was castles, and then allowing bishop takes h6, it was very easy to then start to checkmate the opponent. Okay, and that's the secret. When you're starting off playing chess, that's what you should start looking for. Just put your pieces on good squares. Sure, if your opponent then blunders and lets you capture one of their pieces for free, capture one of their pieces for free. If your opponent blunders and lets you checkmate them, go ahead and checkmate them. But if you go chasing pieces when the position doesn't ask for it, then potentially you're asking for trouble. So thanks for tuning in. Thanks for watching this video. As I said, I'm producing these on an ad hoc basis, mainly for ACT Junior Chess League members, but anyone anyone can watch them on my YouTube channel. So thank you very much, and until next time, I'll see you later.